Hello and welcome to Economics and You. I'm your host, Mr. Samuelson. Today, business fluctuations. The idea that business is not always operating at an ideal sense. It has periods of boom and bust, peak and trough. It's good times and it's bad. Let's take a look at how this impacts the nation as a whole. All right, so we have something called the business cycle. This is a cycle of ups and downs in the economy, which are caused by and called business fluctuations. The idea that businesses have ups and businesses have down. They're all a part of a bigger business cycle. The idea that we now recognize through our studies of economics that this is natural, normal, and it's always been happening. Booms and busts are a part of our business cycle. Now, when we look at macroeconomics, we're going to be measuring all this through GDP and where our GDP is growing and where it's shrinking. Just to clarify our terminology here, we've got our times of growth, which are called booms or prosperity or expansion. And then we have our shrinking economy times, which are our busts, our troughs, our contractions. So we see here right in this model here, we have a time of contraction is where the economy is shrinking. A time of expansion is where the economy is growing. We'll get into recovery in just a moment. So recessions and depressions. These are important things for us to understand in a business cycle, and it's important for us to know that they are a natural part of the business cycle. These happen, and they're, to an extent, supposed to happen, recessions at least. A recession is a period where the economy is contracting for 6 months or more. That is the way economists define a recession. Now, there's no actual clear distinction between recessions and depressions. We don't have a cut and dry line of this is a recession and that is a depression. But it's important to know that when we talk about a depression, we're just talking about a particularly bad recession. Usually a very long one with very big drops in GDP. So that's what we call depression. It's basically a recession that does not recover very quickly. Depressions generally have problems with putting millions and millions of people out of work. Now, in your lifetime, you have seen the Great Recession. The Great Recession happened during your lifetime. Just to put it in contrast, it was a horrible economic time for the United States. But when we compare it with the Great Depression of the 1930s, we see that it really wasn't nearly as bad. Bank failures were a fraction of the problem. Unemployment rate was significant, 9%, 10% unemployment rate. But you compare that to 25%, and that's just a drop in the bucket. Overall economic decline, we had a 26% drop in GDP versus a 3% drop in GDP. And serious deflationary problems during the Great Depression. Deflation is like one of the worst things your economy can really go through. Whereas during the Great Recession, not a problem. Actually, 0.5% inflation is a pretty good place to be in economics. So recovery and expansion. So no matter how bad the economy gets, at some point it's going to start getting better. And as soon as it starts getting better, not less bad, but better, that's when we go into a period of recovery. Now, this begins at that very bottom point. So right here, you're not feeling all that well. Things are not going great for the nation, but you have entered into a recovery phase. Your economy is growing again. And as GDP rises to pre-recession levels, or better yet, a better way to look at it is a trend line. You should have a general trend line upward in your economy. And it would be that point where you pass where you should have been if you hadn't gone into a recession. That's where we call it expansion. That's where your economy is really growing. So we have a recovery point, and then we have an expansion point where your economy is really doing well again. Now, eventually, though, your economy is going to contract. Imagine that there's an R right there, contract, and the business cycle is going to repeat itself because we go through all these ups and downs. This is a very long timeline going from 1870 through 2004 that shows this business cycle. An up and a down, and an up and a down, and an up and a down. That's the business cycle shown in a historic lens. Now, on average, the economy grows, and we see this 2% growth line right here. So we do see a growing economy on an average of 2% over the last 140 years. That is a pretty solid growth rate when put into long-term economic perspectives. Now, we do see some periods where things got bad. The Great Depression was very significant, right? The economy totally crashed right here. This is our 24% drop in GDP. But then we go into a recovery phase, and right at this point, we start going really into an expansion, into a boom. This is where our economy is passing the point where it would have been if it had just continued along the growth rate. So people here are feeling better, right? They're now past the peak of where they were. This is where the Great Depression started. And here's a number of years later, the economy's been growing for a while, but it's only just passing where it was 15 years before. It's not really accelerating until it gets into this phase where it's growing. Then, of course, there's another recession, and we get onto this nice trend line here. If this extended into the Great Recession, we would see another drop, but then another rise. It'd be a fraction of a drop that we saw down here, though. 1990s, yeah, right here. Longest time that we were above that line in our nation's history. We didn't have any serious declines during the 1990s. It was a good time. Now, the Great Recession is the second largest economic downturn of the last 100 years. It began in 2007 and continued into 2009. So it was a recession that lasted about 2 years. That is 2 years of negative GDP growth. That is, our gross domestic product was declining and declining for 2 years. To make it more difficult, we had a very long and slow recovery period. So if you remember that 2% line, we don't go back above that 2% line, that trend in economic growth, until 2014. So we're really just getting out of the recovery period for the Great Recession. It's not been a great recovery, and there's plenty of discussion about that. It has changed our economy in a lot of ways that are hard on a lot of people. But our economy is now expanding. We have gotten out of the Great Recession cycle, and now we're back into an expansion phase in our business cycle. All right, well, that was the business fluctuations part of our course. Thank you very much for joining me today. Hope you learned something, and farewell.